Hello everyone, this is Peak Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have a video giving both a review and a reflection on Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice. Now this review is in preparation for the upcoming Zack Synder Justice League cut, which is due for release on HBO Max on March the 18th. Now I previously did a review of Man of Steel, the first entry within the DCEU, and you can find that link within the description as well. So I thought it would be a good idea to cover the second entry within Zack Snyder's DCEU universe, Batman vs Superman. We'll talk about the good points, the bad points, and where I really felt it left the DC cinematic universe in terms of its position and its connection with fans. Now there will be spoilers within this review, so if you haven't caught up or watched either Man of Steel or Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice, you may want to check out this video quickly, go back and watch those movies and then come back to this review. As with the Man of Steel review, this will tend to be quite a lengthy discussion and topic, so I will also leave a timestamp within the description where I outline the various topics that I discussed throughout this video, so just in case you don't want to watch it in its entirety, you can check out the timestamp for the various topics that you may want to view when watching this video. So the setup here is that, as we all know, Batman vs Superman was the second entry for the DC cinematic universe after the supposed box office underperformance of Man of Steel, which grossed $668 million worldwide. Warner Brothers decided to throw all the eggs into the basket by throwing in Batman, their most profitable character, into a conflict with Superman. Adapting elements of the two classic comic book storylines, The Dark Knight Returns and The Death of Superman, Warner Brothers hoped to capture the imagination of comic book fans with this concept of the two most iconic superheroes fighting against each other. They even went one stage further, including the first cinematic appearance of Wonder Woman on the big screen for the first time, following the previous television series by Linda Carter, and also they included Lex Luthor along with the iconic Superman villain Doomsday. Released on March 25th, 2016, it has Henry Cavill reprising his Superman role, and it also had prolific actor Ben Affleck as the new Batman, whose casting was very controversial at the time. I think we all remember when they announced the involvement of Ben Affleck, it caused a huge outrage within the internet, despite the fact that he had garnered much acclaim recently in terms of his films and his performances as a director. Equally, what caused a lot of topic and discussion was casting very much unknown actress Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman. They also had Jesse Eisenberg as Lex Luthor. They also had Jeremy Irons as Alfred, Amy Adams and Lawrence Fishburne confirming and reprising their roles that they had confirmed throughout Man of Steel. So the overall setup of here is that we continue the storylines from Man of Steel, where we see the world still struggling and dealing with the emergence of Superman following the massive Metropolis Battle against Zod, which left the city completely decimated. This time we look at that Metropolis Battle from the perspective of Bruce Wayne, who we see at the beginning of the movie has just arrived in Metropolis to see some associates, and we get his first view experience of how the Metropolis Battle ensures. We see him running through the various crowds as the exploding cities and buildings continuing to fall down upon him, and following his experience of his event, he uses his Batman identity and dedicates himself fully to destroying Superman because he sees him as the ultimate threat to humanity following the events within Metropolis. We also see Lex Luthor's involvement in manipulating a conflict between the two heroes to further his own agendas. Now looking back on Batman vs Superman, it really was a sign of desperation for me by Warner Brothers. They were so keen to attain the adulation and the box office billions being generated regularly by the MCU. Now ever since it was announced at Comic-Con, if you vividly remember, in 2013, I was never convinced with the idea of Batman vs Superman. I always saw it as a conflict that didn't really have that much range or depth. Logically, Batman wouldn't have a chance against Superman. Superman could defeat him within a nanosecond, since of course Batman has no superpowers. We all know the only realistic or logical way Batman could really win is through the use of kryptonite, and even then Superman would still need to be at some disadvantage for Batman to win. Plus the fact that both are heroes, so it takes away and undercuts the very nature of who they are if they are both fighting against one another. You know, the ultimate thrill of Batman and Superman coming together is that despite the fact that they both want the same ideas, they both want to save people, they both want to uphold justice, they have different methods and different ideologies, and the thrill is watching those philosophies come together and ultimately find a compromise. That's the ultimate excitement whenever we see Batman and Superman on the screen together. So having them fighting against each other for me never truly made any sense at all. I just found the whole setup and the concept was always ridiculous, and I still feel to this day that this should have been a team-up movie. We've seen multiple times through animated series and animated movies of Superman and Batman teaming up together, and those have turned out to be far more exceptional and entertaining. I also think that a lot wasn't helped by the trailers that we saw. I think there was initially 3 trailers that ended up being released, and already if you look at the footage from all of those trailers, they already hinted at Superman and Batman coming together alongside Wonder Woman to fight Doomsday. So any potential for tension or suspense in terms of the conflict was already taken away because we all knew the end result. I think we all agreed that the ending battle would involve the 3 heroes against Doomsday. So as all reviews, I will focus quickly on the positives throughout Batman vs Superman, and I will focus first on Ben Affleck. And I think in terms of a performance, he did to an extent prove a lot of doubters wrong. There was all of this skepticism, as I mentioned before, and it was really due to his association with his earlier roles, whether it be from Pearl Harbor to Daredevil to Giggly, of course, with Jennifer Lopez. But of course, throughout the recent years to come into this release, Ben Affleck had proven to himself both as a consolidated actor and a director. He had previously the hits at the likes of Gone Girl and Argo, of course, which won the Oscar for Best Picture, and also The Town, which is a very good movie as well, starring alongside Jeremy Renner. So at this point, he was a far more established and credible actor within the entertainment industry, and I think this performance here is very good. He's much more of a weary, kind of tired and older version of Batman. I'll talk about it more later on about this video, but in terms of a pure performance, I think Ben Affleck did it very well, despite the fact I didn't agree with the interpretation of the character. We also have Gal Gadot, who, despite a small appearance, I think made a good impression as Wonder Woman. She was very much looking the part, and she gained a lot of goodwill from this appearance, which we really didn't see throughout in terms of the costume towards the climatic part of the movie. But despite this, I think she did very well with what material that she was given, and she would obviously use this goodwill and recognition and move forward to greater success and acclaim with the Wonder Woman movie, which came out the following year in 2017. I also liked Jeremy Irons as Alfred. He was very much of a strong, sterner version, very similar to what we saw with the Michael Caine version of Alfred from the Christopher Nolan Dark Knight trilogy. But I think the difference here, this version of Alfred seems a lot more physically active. He seems to get a lot more involved. I think the Michael Caine version was much more of a surrogate father, but here this is much more of a critical personality, never hesitant to tell Bruce where he's going wrong. And Jeremy Irons, who is a masterful actor, he had a very sarcastic and very realistic tone about him, and I think that was always good in terms of grounding Bruce Wayne. Like with Man of Steel, there was at least an intent to tell a very serious, epic story full of themes and ideas. So I can always respect any superhero movie that wants to further its ambitions rather than just having the good guy against the villain. I can always respect that about any movie that at least wants to tell something with more depth and more substance. Now, unfortunately, I will have to talk about the many issues with this film, so I will try to be concise as I possibly can when going through the multiple problems that I found throughout this movie. Now, first of all, we have to talk about the interpretation of superheroes and staying true to their nature. I recently made reference to this in Man of Steel review, where I talked about how I felt the interpretation of Superman wasn't true to the character. And the ultimate defense of that argument was that Man of Steel was meant to be the Superman in his first stages as the superhero. He wasn't quite well aware, or wasn't quite well adapted in terms of the protector of the planet Earth. So Batman vs Superman would see a further progression of this character and become the far more established traditional hero that we all know him for. But that wasn't the case of Batman Superman. What we actually got was a regression of the character. Through certain events, this is a Superman who is still vilified by the public. We see multiple scenes where they are protesting against him, telling him to go home. We have that famous scene from the trailer where they paint over the statue of Metropolis that he's a false god, he's an illegal alien, that he has too much power and too much control. So we still haven't got over that concept of being fearful and paranoid about Superman. We haven't moved on in terms of the overall arc of the character. In this movie, he's still very indecisive, incompetent, and not even being aware of what's going around him. And even worse, he's much more of a reluctant hero who still seems more concerned with being with Lois Lane as opposed to saving the world. The role of the Earth's protector is still very much a burden to him. We see him quoting in certain lines that he doesn't care about what the people think, and that this isn't his planet, this isn't his world. And I just found it very disappointing that we hadn't really progressed further on from Man of Steel, so that we had gone backwards and doubled down in terms of the depressant, the self-loathing, the introspective version of the character, and it just felt even more removed of Superman than what we had in Man of Steel. If the Superman interpretation was bad, then we seriously have to talk about how they presented Batman throughout this movie as well. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, they took a lot of inspiration from Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns. If you know anything about that comic, that is very much of an Elseworld story with a Batman at the end of his career, where he's a much more of a brutal, aggressive character. And in this movie, we see multiple scenes of Batman stamping people, branding people, and yes, killing multiple people throughout various scenes. Now, people will allude to the fact that various other iterations of Batman movies have had him killed, but not to this level. We see multiple sequences, what we saw throughout the trailers, where he's fighting people in the warehouse and he's shooting people. We have the very frenetic car chase sequence throughout the middle of the movie, where he's seemingly just crashing through certain cars with criminals inside them, causing them to explode and surely killing the people inside them. And again, much like Superman from Man of Steel, showing no real awareness or consideration of the carnage that is being caused around them. This is very much a Punisher-like version of the character, which is wrong, because like Superman, Batman doesn't kill. There's always a line that he will never cross, and that line is really what separates him from the villains that he pursues within Gotham. We also look at the Batman from the ideological and personality point of view. Now, we normally associate Batman as a much more of a smarter, strategical, always thinking of his adversaries in a logical manner. But in this movie, he's very much of a paranoid, neurotic, and very delusional personality, and he's almost unhinged. We have that quote when he's talking to Alfred halfway through, when he's stating that if there's a 1% chance that people are evil, we have to take that with an absolute certainty. Now, Batman would never think like this. Batman would always weigh things up. He always assesses what's going on and then makes a very smart and critical judgment. But this Batman is a Batman that never thinks. He never really takes stock of the situation. He just rushes in, and again, it goes completely against the character. You know, we'll just see Batman is asking rational questions like, if Superman is evil, then why hasn't he destroyed us? Why hasn't he tried to take over the planet? This is a perfectly logical question that Batman never truly asks throughout this movie, and it's just really typical of what we consider with the character, despite the fact that Ben Affleck does produce a good performance. The fact is that Batman deems Superman to be a menace to the society, yet he's even more of a menace than Superman throughout this movie. He kills a lot more people than what Superman does. So how can he deem Superman a threat if he's doing the same things that he's accusing Superman of? It just doesn't make any sense, and again goes against completely the nature and the thought process that we associate with Batman. The movie as a whole has a lot of pacing issues where the story takes too long to get going, the translation from certain scenes is very sloppy, and there are many mistakes, I think, in terms of the editing. There's no real sense of composure in terms of story arcs or sequences that really blend in together. It feels very choppy and edited, fast paced, as they have a lot of story that they tried to cram into, and they really didn't want the pace to linger on as they were trying to get through whatever story they were trying to tell, and it just has a very messy feel in terms of its plot and its narrative. The story itself can really never fully justify the conflict between Batman and Superman, and I always felt that going into this movie, the ultimate turning point when Batman and Superman go from being enemies to being friends was always a point that couldn't be a throwaway moment. That had to be a really weight-driven and substantial moment for it to convince audiences, and it never is like that. It's such a quick turnaround where they become enemies and friends, and it just never works. And again, it highlights many of the flaws within the stories and concepts that they were trying to build out throughout this movie. I mentioned before the use of the iconic storybooks the iconic storylines Dark Knight Returns and Death of Superman, and both storylines are ones that really you should be utilising at the end of your cinematic universe, kind of like what we had with Avengers Infinity War. Now imagine if you had Infinity War at the beginning of your cinematic universe, it just wouldn't make sense and it just wouldn't carry the impact that those storylines should. So I just think it was a massive underutilization of both these iconic storylines, which really could merit their own movie. So once again, this is another failure and mistake from Warner Brothers. The story itself is just never engrossing, it's never compelling, and after a while it becomes very boring, I think, towards the final climax, lacking any real sense of charm or wit, and even any scenes of brevity, just to kind of take you away from the kind of hardcore seriousness that runs throughout this movie, just to make it a bit more entertaining and a bit more enjoyable to watch. But there's none of those elements there, so the movie just becomes a real slog to get through. The film's aesthetic, as what we mentioned with Man of Steel, again has that very muted, grey, unappealing tone about it, and it's very ugly, I think, to look at for a lot of the time. Another major issue was Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor, and this is yet again another disappointing interpretation of the character. For some strange reason, they went for a much more Jim Carrey-esque, jokey personality, for which you just can never take the villain seriously. You think of how good the Smallville version was, where we had Michael Rosenbaum in the role as Lex Luthor. That would, for me, still is the best live action interpretation of the character, and that was a character you could really take seriously. There was a lot of layers and depth and emotion to that character. So I thought we would get something similar for Batman vs Superman, but that wasn't the case. And again, it's not a fault of Jesse Eisenberg himself. Again, this is just a fault of the writing, that they went for such a cheesy comic style character, and that really hurt this film whenever he is on screen. Very frustrating to watch, and his motivations just never truly clear as to why exactly he wants Batman and Superman to fight each other. We then go into the movie's most notorious scene. I'm pretty sure you all know what I'm talking about now, where the eventual fight between Superman comes to a climax, and that ultimate moment when they stop fighting and turn around and be friends, the infamous Martha scene. Batman has Superman virtually at his mercy, and then Lois intervenes, telling him that his mother is Martha. Superman states to him, "Save Martha," and then all of a sudden the conflict stops because both of their mothers have the same name. Just thought it was so ridiculous. Completely undercuts Batman, who's been obsessed with destroying Superman for all of these years, and all of a sudden when he's got him where he wants him, he stops because his mother is Martha. It never makes sense. Are we then to say that if Batman comes across, let's say, the Joker or Killer Croc or the Mad Hatter or Bane, and he has a chance to apprehend his villains, but then he won't go against them because if they have the same name as one of his parents? It's just a completely stupid moment, and once again just undervalues any credibility that the characters have, particularly in Batman. As later on when we see when Superman, when he recovers, for some reason he entrusts Batman with going to save his mother, because the setup here is to have Gotham and Metropolis across the border. Superman could easily super speed and save his mother and then come back and take on the lingering threat of Lex Luthor, but for some reason he chooses to have Batman rescue his mother, even though he's barely known him for 2 seconds, and prior to Lois intervening, Batman was ready to kill him. Again, just undercuts the character's credibility completely, and completely makes no sense. So of course we come to the final climax when we see the Trinity, of course, Superman, Batman and Wonder Woman working together against Doomsday. And yes, I can't lie that when watching this, there was a thrill, even though that had been dilated because we had already seen that scene within the trailers. There was still some thrill seeing the Trinity on the screen for the first time, and that's really more because of my love for these characters. I've got such a great affection for these characters, and I still believe that if you handle this fight, this could have been an incredible sequence. But again, it turns out to be really an incoherent mess. There's loads of CGI and heavy lighting and lens flare all over the place. You can barely make out what's going on. This results, of course, with Superman dying. It's a moment that never really works because we haven't truly had the heroic version. So when he dies, it literally carries no impact, no weight, and it just feels empty. It's just a complete waste of the storyline that we really shouldn't have seen till later on in the universe, which was I've alluded to before. And I think overall it just sums up the movie as a whole, and it just seems for me a massive wasted opportunity. It had a lot of big ideas and big themes that it intended to use, but it just didn't have the skill or the wit or composure to really pull these ideas through while showcasing 3 of the most iconic superhero characters. So overall for me, Batman vs Superman was such a crushing disappointment and a further step back for the DC cinematic universe. So if I had to give it an overall score, I would give it a 4 out of 10. So if we focus on the release of Batman vs Superman, it did have a massive opening of 166 million at the box office and eventually went on to gross over $873.6 million at the box office, and this was on a budget of around 250 to 300 million. So yes, it did make its money back, and yes, it did make profits, but when we consider, as I mentioned before, that you are including 3 of the most iconic superheroes, along with the inclusion of Lex Luthor and the inclusion of Doomsday, this really should have grossed well over $1 billion. This is essentially a Justice League light movie, and it really underperformed considering all the characters that they had at their disposal, and you really look back on it and it really garnered a massively negative reception. It had one of the biggest drop off in terms of the second box office weekends. I think it was around about 72%, even worse than what we see for the Ang Lee's Hulk film back in 2003. So a lot of audiences just couldn't connect to these versions of the character despite their recognition. And it showed again the failure of Warner Brothers in the fact that they wanted to fast track their way to the success of the MCU without really taking into account what made the MCU so special. The fact that they took the building blocks by introducing solo characters one at a time, allowing audience to digest these characters within their solo adventures first before going into the team up movies. And I still maintain that had they taken the same considered approach with the DC cinematic heroes than what they did with the Marvel heroes, then I firmly believe that the DC cinematic universe would have been even more successful than the MCU. I firmly believe that purely because the DC heroes, in particular of Superman, Batman and Wonder Woman, they have a worldwide recognition. Everybody knows who these heroes were. Even if you are a non-comic book fan, you still have some idea of who these characters are, and that's already half the battle. So again, this really should have been a massive success, and I just wish in hindsight and reflection that Warner Brothers had really just held back and taken more stock and time in developing their characters. They would have had a far more successful run had they managed to do so. Now, of course, people will mention the extended edition of Batman vs Superman that came out on home media release shortly after the cinematic release, and in that edition, yes, we did have a 31 extra minutes, and it was an R-rated version. And whilst there was more involvement of Clark Kent involved and the film did feel more cohesive, we had a few more details of Bruce Wayne, we had a lot more explanation in terms of the incident within Africa that we saw in the beginning of the movie, which gave a lot more explanation as to why people felt Superman was responsible. So yes, there was a bit more of a composed feel about the movie, but still overall it didn't fix the numerous flaws that we saw throughout Batman vs Superman. So a lot of people were trying to champion the Ultimate Edition as what the true version was, but I don't think it addressed the bigger flaws and issues that what we saw really in the overall concept of this whole enterprise. You know, I'll go back to again, the idea of Batman fighting Superman was completely ridiculous, and despite the extended edition being around, it still didn't fix the overall tone and the lack of really characterization and wonder and escapism and thrill and excitement that we normally associate with these comic book heroes and comic book characters. So we look at the overall legacy of Batman vs Superman, and of course it later on led to the ultimate underperformance of the Justice League, which was released in 2017, despite the fact that Joss Whedon took over directing duties from Zack Synder and chopped and changed a lot of his vision. It still was really more of a casualty of the underperformance and the bad taste left by Batman vs Superman. So we will never truly know that if Batman vs Superman had been really more true to these characters and had a lot more of that escapism and adventure and connected more with audiences, whether Justice League itself would have been a bigger hit. And maybe indeed we may have got Justice League 2 and Justice League 3 and the truer versions of Zack Snyder's version that we will most likely see when his Snyder Cut is released on March the 18th. So those are my thoughts and feelings on Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice. Let me know what you think in the comments below. What do you think about this movie in comparison to Man of Steel? Did you think it was an improvement? Did you think it was more lackluster? Where do you hold your positions on Batman vs Superman in terms of the legacy and how it affected the later release of Justice League? Do you think had it been an improved movie that we would be sitting here looking forward more to further Justice League and Man of Steel sequels, and as well further adventures with Ben Affleck's Batman adventure as well? So those are my thoughts and feelings. Please let me know what you think in the comments below. If I have time, I may do a quick review of the Justice League version that we saw in 2017, directed by Joss Whedon, and then I would have covered all of the 3 major entries within the DCU before we go ahead with viewing the Zack Snyder Cut, which I'm sure a lot of us are looking forward to, and I will try and do a critical review of that movie when it comes out as soon as possible. So those are my thoughts. Please hit those like and subscribe and notification buttons and help me provide more high quality content for you in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.